What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for XCOM Enemy Unknown, though we will be covering a bit of its expansion, Enemy Within, at the same time, which is about time because realistically I would say XCOM Enemy Unknown and its sequel, XCOM 2, are kind of foundational to the TRPG genre in the modern era. But almost certainly worth a mention that Enemy Unknown in particular is actually a reimagining of a 1994 title, I believe it was, called UFO Defense. Itself a very big deal for the genre way back when, so perhaps fitting then that this reimagining again went on to be such a big deal. However, before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about Enemy Unknown here. So for starters, obviously, did not get a review key or anything for this. I would be roughly 14 years late, as this game originally released back in 2012. Now, I have played it and its sequel a bit here and there over the years, but what was new for me here was actually the Enemy Within specifically. I had never played the expansion, though I have owned these games on Steam for an extremely long time. And much of this experience was really just about me finally getting this added into the catalog of important games that I can cover and review at some point, and that's most of what we're doing here, but it did give me some new content in the form of, again, the Enemy Within stuff, which we will get into. A few various things I would like to mention first. For starters, like a year or two back, they tried to add the 2K launcher to the XCOM games over on Steam, and it caused all sorts of problems, like the games just wouldn't start for most people at that point. Those did wind up getting removed, and everything should be back to normal, but I'd wanted to mention it because I actually still see some more recent reports of people having trouble getting the game started because of that stuff. So you may or may not have some hit or miss problems with that. What's more, you can't really talk about XCOM without somebody inevitably mentioning the Long War mod. I'm not covering it. I don't review mods. I understand it's very popular, but truth be told, it is of no great interest to me, because as the name might imply, it seems like it would take entirely too long for my taste. But people do really love it. If you enjoy the game and you try it after this review or whatever, maybe that's something you would want to check in on. So naturally, I wanted to give it a bit of a shout out here. A couple other things I wanted to mention, more specifically about the achievements. So XCOM Enemy Unknown had a multiplayer aspect to it. I initially did my first impressions for this game quite some time ago. I think it was back in like September of 2025. When I made that impressions video, I mentioned getting the 2 multiplayer achievements this game has, which are bubonic and another one for simply winning a multiplayer match. A lot of people reached out after that video to offer me help doing exactly that, and so I was able to set that up via my position as a YouTuber basically and get that done. But the multiplayer aspect itself isn't really going to be a function of this review at all, as it's not exactly a big part of the game these days. But speaking of achievements, by far and away the most annoying one to get is actually an achievement called a Continental Fellow, which involves winning the game from all of its starting positions, which means at a minimum you'll have to play the game 5 times through. And that's not even counting all the difficulty achievements. However, I wanted to point out something because I found 2 conflicting answers when I was doing research about this, and I wound up having to do a 6th playthrough because of it. On Steam, at least, XCOM Enemy Unknown and XCOM Enemy Within are like one Steam entry, so to speak. It's just that you choose which version you want to play when you start up the game over on Steam, and what this ultimately means is that you can play with or without the expansion content. The thing there that you have to be mindful of is that a lot of the achievement counters and stuff are specific to the version of the game you are playing. So in addition to the achievements that are only available in Enemy Within because of the fact that they're expansion content, stuff like a Continental Fellow that requires you to beat the game in the 5 starting locations requires you to do that all on one version of the game or the other. When I was initially looking this up, I found a source that said you could split them between, and I found a source that said you needed to do it all on one. And so ultimately, I wound up doing my first playthrough just on Enemy Unknown to set a sort of baseline and remind myself of what the game was fully about, as it had been a while. So the next 4 playthroughs were all Enemy Within in the different starting locations, and I was able to confirm that way that, yeah, you do have to do all 5 of the starting locations on, probably Enemy Within at the end of the day, in order to grab that achievement. But this counter thing does also extend to other parts of it, like there is an achievement for shooting down like 40 UFOs, and that one actually requires you to also do that on one version of the game or the other. it doesn't transfer progress between them, just so you're aware. Now, before we go too much farther, I keep mentioning Enemy Within, so let's talk a little bit about the differences there between Unknown and Within. So, to be very frank with you, XCOM Enemy Unknown as a base is a really light game. There's really not that much to it, and the expansion does a lot in terms of expanding what the game actually offers content-wise, including a secondary threat you have to fight against known as Exalt. These people will do covert operations against you and cause little hiccups and problems for you that you have to solve and fight back against before taking out their headquarters. In addition to that, you get access to mech troopers, which are basically a soldier who pilots a mech. You get access to the gene labs where you can modify your soldiers to take on traits from the aliens to do special stuff. That's really cool. And it also comes with some more varied and unique missions along the way. Now, that's not the only place to get unique missions, because the other bit of DLC you can pick up for XCOM is actually things like the Slingshot Pack. These packs, which you can enable or disable at the start of a game, add extra set-in-stone missions that give you set characters you can use as soldiers, which is important because they are guaranteed to be psi-adepts later in the game, just in case you find yourself wondering what those are. So in all seriousness though, Enemy Within probably adds like 50% more overall content to the game, just in terms of sheer options and the like, which I thought was noteworthy. From there, let's talk technical state. How is this game running these days? Well, for the most part, pretty well. I didn't really have any problems. As I mentioned, there was that launcher issue a few years ago that people have reported some issues with still, but mostly seems to have gone away now that they took the launcher away and stopped trying to do that. Otherwise, really the only thing for me to report personally is that sometimes the game would hang a little, like little freezes here and there, especially on turn rollovers, that kind of thing, but that was really about it. Everything else was more or less fine. I would be surprised if you had too many issues with this game. I still see the occasional reports of problems just looking into it, so it's not impossible you might run into some problems, mind you, but for the most part it seems to be working well enough for most people. Now, next up, let's talk difficulty about this game, because that is an interesting subject when it comes to XCOM Enemy Unknown and Enemy Within. Difficulty affects both the strategy and tactical layer. So when it comes to gameplay for this title, you're really down to the strategy aspect of it, which is building out your base, managing your soldiers, all your research, your upgrades, that kind of thing, and then the actual tactical battles. Difficulty affects both of these things, and those difficulties are easy, normal, classic, or impossible as a baseline. Now, there are further modifiers that can be accessed initially, just like little advanced options like, whether or not to enable the tutorial or the mission packs, that kind of thing. But once you beat the game for the first time, you'll also actually access the second wave at that point. Second wave are a whole host of different modifiers that change how the game plays. Most of these are neutral in the sense that they affect both the enemy and you. One of them in particular I want to call out though is especially noteworthy because it's like the main reason I got through impossible difficulty, to be honest, which is save scumming. So one thing to know about how XCOM handles save scumming is that you can save in the middle of missions, yes. The thing is, normally, loading up a save and performing the exact same action over and over again will not result in a different outcome. This is because the way the save games are handled, it assigns an RNG seed basically to your save file and ensures that it doesn't change what you do immediately afterwards. Even then, it is still possible to load up an older save and take slightly different actions, mind you, which might actually help you out. But the second wave save scum option changes this. It allows you to load up a save game, do the same thing, and actually get a different outcome. As long as you're not playing on Iron Man, of course, which is also one of the potential options you could enable if you want to go the Iron Man route and eat a failure, which you may well fail a couple times on impossible difficulty, whether you've got Iron Man enabled or not, mind you, but simply put, being able to save scum my way through impossible was extremely helpful. In any event though, when you either fail or beat the game on a given difficulty, you'll get a summary of your stats, kind of showing you generally how you did. And I wanted to mention that in particular because I would actually, and this may sound a little strange, recommend losing the game at least once. And the reason for that is that losing the game is actually the canon ending, and you get a special cutscene for it even. So as a baseline, you've got all these different difficulty modes, modifiers, things you can change, adjust, that stuff. It'll give you a summary of your stats at the end of a playthrough, that kind of thing. All well and good. So from there, let's actually talk about what these difficulties actually change. Why is impossible so hard, as an example? Well, as I mentioned, these difficulties touch on both the strategy and tactical layer. On the tactical side of things, most of what this means is simply increasing health of enemies, causing there to be potentially more enemies, and making them more deadly by basically giving them better aim, making them more likely to hit you. There's a little more to it than that, but that's basically the gist of it. Truth be told, though, I would realistically say the more difficult aspect of the difficulty modes is actually what it does to the strategy layer. So in order to fail a campaign, basically what that means is that countries leave the XCOM project as you're fighting back against these aliens, and the higher the difficulty, the more likely that scenario becomes because of how much people are panicking. In order for a country to leave the XCOM project, their panic has to rise and then make it at that elevated state until the end of the month when you get a council report. That's when all the countries leave, if their panic is at the requisite level. So these higher difficulties just make panic rise faster while also making that a harder thing to combat. In fact, the nice thing about Impossible is that you can sort of learn your way through it the hard way simply by the fact that if you're going to lose, it's probably going to happen pretty early because you got to get your panic under control and you got to get your satellites up. One of the ways you will combat panic is by putting out satellites. Satellites both give you more money, which you are going to get less of on higher difficulties, but they also allow you to, of course, scan for aliens and combat potential threats, which will keep panic down. The higher the difficulty, the harder all of that is to do by either just straight up making it more expensive, setting a base global panic, meaning that when you start the game on Impossible, countries are already panicking a little bit, and the amount of panic that they gain from alien activities also increases. So I guess to put it simply, the higher the difficulty, the more you have to do with less resources. Now, luckily for everybody involved, there is that Save Scum Second Wave option I mentioned, but there are also some really fantastic guides over on Steam that I made a lot of use of, including one that basically gives you like a step-by-step guide of what to research when on higher difficulties. And while it's not a foolproof way to get through the game, mind you, it is extremely helpful in kind of learning what to do, and I personally found it extraordinarily helpful. I'm probably going to link that one below, actually. Next up, let's talk starting locations. So you can pick a starting location of basically one of 5 different continents, and each one comes with their own bonus. Now, this is interesting because the continent you start out will always give you the bonus associated with that continent. All of the other bonuses can be acquired if you get full satellite coverage of that continent, then you'll get the bonus from them. The catch being that if, a country leaves from that bonus, then you can't get the bonus from that anymore. So that's kind of a bummer. And so your starting location is important. On higher difficulties, you pretty much always go Africa simply because it increases your funding and money is very tight on higher difficulties, and that is going to be more valuable than anything else. On lower difficulties, it's not nearly as important, mind you. However, I will say the 2-country bonus from South America, the We Have Ways, which gives you instant interrogations and autopsies on the aliens you kill and capture, is really useful, but it's also really easy to get because it has the smallest country requirement. The other bonuses are really useful, but a little less integral, but stuff like North America will give you reduced repair costs on your ships, which you'll have to send out to destroy UFOs, that kind of thing. So be aware of that when you are picking your starting location. Now, before we go too much farther, let's talk a little bit about the story, but the story is extremely simple. Basically, the world is being invaded by aliens, and the XCOM project is a project funded by all the nations of the world, more or less, not literally all of them, but you get the gist, to put a stop to that. And your job is to try to protect those countries, keep the alien influence to a minimum, fight against them, and try to prevent this invasion from being successful. That is pretty much it story-wise. There's a little more to it in terms of specific events and things you're going to try to do, like capture and interrogate aliens, learn about their goals. There's a base assault, there's a base defense mission on Enemy Within. Eventually, this gives you access to psi powers or psychic powers, which you're going to need to complete the game. It's going to give you specific research options, like upgrading your ships and interceptors so you can take down their UFOs easier, with things like the Firestorm. But honestly, extremely straightforward story. The main thing I wanted to mention here actually is that, kind of curiously, and something I enjoy about this game, is that the canon ending to XCOM, if you didn't know, is that you lose. XCOM 2 takes place under the presumption that you lost an Impossible Iron Man run in the first game. I always thought that was really interesting, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say about it, in fact. So let's keep it moving and talk now about the strategy and tactical layers. Now, it's important to understand that these kind of inform each other. It's hard to separate them because how well you do in the strategy part of it affects how well you're going to do in the tactical part of it, thanks to like weapons and gear, but your success in the tactical missions also makes like the strategy side of things easier, and it's important to understand the interplay between those things. So we're going to talk about the strategy layer first, and as I already kind of alluded to earlier, yes, there is absolutely kind of like an ideal progression to the strategy side of things, like what to do when, what to research when. There should be guides on Steam, and I'm probably going to link one below that I found really helpful, but maybe keep that in mind as we're going through here. But the strategy side of things basically comes down to handling your overall base, which does include building various rooms and stuff, handling research, engineering, building up items, and even managing your soldiers. So your physical base, you do actually have to build this out, which includes excavating and then building facilities within said base to accommodate your needs. This includes powering them with things like power generators, which you'll also have to build. And this is another thing that is greatly affected by difficulty. On easy and normal, you'll get access to the officer training school straight away. The officer training school, based on the highest ranking soldier you have currently, is able to allow you to purchase upgrades to give you things like an increased squad size or extra XP, that kind of thing, and that will make life easier for you, but on classic and impossible difficulty, you have to build that yourself. So managing your base is a huge part of this, especially for your satellites, because a big part of the strategy layer and one of the common ways you'll see people approach this game is what they call a satellite rush, which is basically rushing to get your satellites up as quickly as possible to give you massive amounts of resources to quickly burn through the rest of the elements of the game, which is, like the research and the engineering and everything. But before you can do any of that, you need scientists and engineers, which are typically gained monthly, at least anyway, from the countries funding the project based on how many satellites and stuff you have up. It is also possible to get them as rewards for missions. You also get some when you build stuff like laboratories and workshops. Having more scientists and engineers both enables new things, being able to actually do them, like construct certain stuff, but also increases the pace and cost of those things. The more scientists you have, the faster you can research. The more engineers you have, the more stuff you can build. And for cheaper, no less. So that is really, really important. Satellites especially, though, because they're going to allow you to counter alien activity and reduce the global panic, because any alien threat you ignore or do not respond to, either due to lack of resources or just lack of interest, will increase panic in the given continent usually, and that is going to then have repercussions when those countries start dropping out at the end of the month. How well you handle all of this stuff, which is typically, actually doing missions and then addressing any UFOs that come up on your satellite coverage, affects your score at the council report at the end of the month. Truth be told, the letter grade really doesn't matter that much. But it's important to mention that no country will leave the project until the council report, and that means it's actually really great to wait to launch satellites because you don't get the money or rewards from them until the council report either. So a convenient way, especially on higher difficulties, to sort of mitigate some of the panic is let the countries that are panicking panic until right before the council report and then launch the satellites, which will lower their panic at no cost to you, meaning you don't have to address it multiple times per month as an example. But basically 8 of these countries withdraw and you lose, so managing against that is naturally pretty important. Now, in order to deal with UFOs, you're going to have to send your interceptors at first after them, but then later on your firestorms, and these are basically the aircraft that you're going to send to try to crash UFOs so you can assault them and ideally gain materials that you can't gain anywhere else. Now, your initial ships, your just kind of regular fighter aircraft that you would be familiar with today, aren't exactly super well equipped for this, but you can upgrade them with a variety of weapons to help them take down different types of ships. Eventually through the story you'll have to upgrade them, but this is mostly done through research, and you'll find the Firestorm. Firestorm is like a mix of fighter aircraft and UFO that is extremely powerful, and if you upgrade that with even better weapons, it's basically unkillable. The thing is, you need one for each continent at least. And that's going to allow you to respond to all the different UFOs and stuff and potentially pick up their resources. Killing them this way, or specifically downing the ships and then sending a tactical mission in to go kill all the aliens there, will give you the resources from that downed ship. Important to mention, though, that your choices there in terms of like explosives and stuff will give you more or less resources to use. So that's a really big part of it, mind you. And then every few days as you're cycling through mission control, scanning for this stuff, there are potential options for other missions to pop up, like specific requests from the council as an example, or the special missions from the packs. And your job is basically to manage all of this while also managing your gear and your soldiers, because what your scientists are doing is research into all this alien technology, and that's going to allow you to then build it and outfit your soldiers with it. This is where your engineers come in. Once you've researched all this tech, you have to actually build it and outfit your characters with it, which is where you're going to get all your upgrades to things like the actual armor you're wearing, the weapons you're using, the accessories or explosives they'll bring with them. An example, early on you have to build an arc thrower at some point so you can start kidnapping aliens by stunning them instead of killing them, and then bring them back to interrogate them, which will then give you research credits to research this stuff faster and get it moving more quickly. And as you'd probably guess, your soldiers have a few different class and upgrade paths all their own. You've got your base classes like the heavy, the assault, the support, or the sniper, and those are great. They all have their own like little perk choices as they level up and rank up and everything, and you can even customize their appearances and stuff. But Enemy Within takes this a step farther by giving you even more options. You can choose to take one of those soldiers and turn them into a mech soldier as an example. The mech soldier fully changes their class and gives you the ability to put them in a separate mech that you have to build and upgrade as well. And those things are brutal. They are really awesome to play around with, actually. The catch to these guys, however, is that their previous class does actually matter. It will give them a sort of base skill or passive skill that is always in effect based on the class of soldier you turned into a mech soldier. And then there's the gene augmented soldiers as well. The guys who have been infused with alien DNA, it would seem. They can get all sorts of special abilities like being able to just leap up on top of buildings, or inherent camouflage that will cause them to be invisible to enemies, which is really helpful. And while this is not part of Enemy Within, it is something worth mentioning. You can also use shivs, which are basically little robots you can send into combat in place of a soldier. I didn't like using these guys personally just because I found them to be a little high cost, high maintenance. Like, it takes a lot to turn these guys into something you would want to use over an actual soldier, and so while it might be situationally useful, I did not find shivs to be something I liked playing around with, but nonetheless, worth a mention for sure. Later in the game, you can start screening your soldiers for psi potential. All of the characters and recruits you get as part of the packs and missions are all guaranteed psi adepts. Those are an easy way to get them, but you will need at least one to finish the story. And these guys, of course, as you would probably expect, get access to some psi abilities like mind control or just a general mental assault on enemies, that kind of thing, and it will give you some more options in combat as well. So that's pretty fun. But from there, let's go ahead and talk about the tactical side of things, or the actual combat as you would expect it. Now, this is interesting because I think if you've played any modern TRPG almost, you would likely be familiar with what XCOM Enemy Unknown is all about, because this game was so successful with that system, that being its 2-point turn-based action point system, that so many TRPGs were just like, this is the way forward. And that's kind of why this game is so foundational to the genre. So many games copied what this game set up with its action point system. Now, here in this version, it is, I would say, noticeably a little early on in the iterations, and so it might not have some of the quality of life type stuff you may well be used to, but the core of it is all there. Turn-based 2 action point system, either use its double move and shoot, or use soldier abilities to abuse it a little bit, like the sniper's in the zone ability that gives them basically a free action if they kill something that isn't in cover or flanked. And given that your initial squad size of 4 and your maximum squad size of 6 is going to be a little limited compared to the potentially 20 to 30 enemies you might see in a mission later on in the game, leaves you a bit outnumbered, and so you're going to have to be smart about how you approach these things. The way you're going to do that primarily, though, is mitigating your interactions with the enemies, because the way XCOM in particular handles its missions is that the enemies are on the map in pods, basically small groups of enemies. They only activate if they come into your vision range. They will kind of move around on their own in between like certain patrol routes, and they will respond to sound if you like kick doors open or break windows, that kind of thing. So while there might be 20-something enemies in a mission compared to your maximum of 6, what you can do instead is just encounter them very slowly. And on higher difficulties, that's really the way to go. You kind of want to move at a snail's pace and only interact with ideally like one pod of enemies at a time. But even then, you have to be careful because probably one of the more notorious things about XCOM in general is its hit chance. Well, this is a variety of factors. Ultimately, things like the individual soldier you are using's aim stat, alongside other environmental stuff like, cover, half, or full. By the way, if you're using half on higher difficulties, you're wrong. And even just stuff like the exact angle, elevation, that kind of thing. So basically, you want to ideally maximize your chance to hit, but people will tell you that, of course, they miss even on like 98%, and that's because XCOM doesn't usually tell you the whole story with its exact percent chances, not to mention the way it handles its RNG with its RNG seeds that I mentioned that are attached to the save file. So keep in mind, yes, you can miss, even with an incredibly high percent chance to hit. In fact, I missed a 99% chance to hit. Another big aspect of this, though, is difficulty, because on higher difficulties, your characters have less base health and enemies will typically have a little more, which is really, really impactful in the beginning of the game. So like on impossible difficulty on your first tactical missions, it's very possible for enemy aliens to one-shot you, and because your first mission is always with rookies, that's a really hard first mission, because rookies don't have access to their initial class. That comes with their first promotion, and so that initial battle is really, really hard because enemies can kill you very, very easily, and there's a chance your weapons, due to their increased health, won't kill them. And that's why I had to use things like save scumming on impossible difficulty quite a bit myself as an example. Another aspect of this, though, I was talking about those enemy pods. So something important to understand about the way this is set up is that when you first encounter an enemy pod, no matter whose turn it is, they will get a free move into cover. So unfortunately, even if you discover them on your turn, early in your turn, as you would want, and by the way, it's team-based turns, they are going to run immediately for cover. And that is actually why it is incredibly important that you do not discover a pod of enemies right as your turn is ending, which is another reason you got to be really careful with your movement and not be running into unknown territory right as your turn is ending with, say, your last character move that turn. You got to take it nice and slow. In terms of movement, anyway, you don't actually have to play that slow because the missions themselves aren't terribly long, honestly, but still. Now, generally speaking, the rest of combat then, as that would probably imply, is really all about trying to shut down the enemy action economy. Take them on bit by bit. Don't activate like 6 or 7 enemies all at once. Break them off into manageable little chunks via their pods, take them out, crawl forward, find the next one. But even then, something that will really help you out there is stuff like suppression and disabling and in the zone, the stuff that will allow you to take advantage of that action economy even further. So abilities that you get from certain classes like suppression will drastically reduce enemy aim. Snipers can get an ability called disabling shot, which can shut down an enemy, which is super handy in certain situations. And so while yes, overwhelming firepower can be incredibly useful and make short work of certain boss encounters, that type of thing, I say the word boss kind of loosely, it's more just like the enemies you're facing at the time, but certain set encounters and certain missions, that kind of thing. Certain abilities are very useful in that situation, but I think an important lesson to learn in playing these games is like when to not necessarily go for the kill and leave yourself vulnerable, but rather when to shut enemies down and let your turn roll over. The other aspect, of course, being all the different types of aliens. So one thing that this game does pretty nicely, actually, is while there isn't an incredible amount of variety, there is a good amount of variety in the different types of aliens, all of which have their own like behavior and stats and AI. How they behave exactly is also a function of difficulty. They're a little reined in on easy and normal, whereas they tend to be much more aggressive on classic and impossible. And there is an aspect of knowing what you're fighting at the same time, even if fortunately the same can't really be said for the mission variety, which is actually quite low. That's something they clearly tried to address with things like the DLC packs, which had more set in stone missions with like set layouts and approaches and are a little more curated than the RNG stuff. But that's also something else I wanted to mention in and of itself, which is the RNG. Sometimes you just get unlucky, and the higher the difficulty, the more likely it is that you are going to be quite unlucky. And I think if I had one criticism of the way this is implemented in this game in particular, is that sometimes the difficulty, especially the increases in difficulty, difficulty feel like more of a function of just straight up luck than it is mastery on your end. And while that may be realistic enough for something like a TRPG where you're just trying to swing the odds in your favor, it's clearly something that was still in flux with a game like this, because there are times where it just feels bad. Especially on higher difficulties where you're giving enemies aim bonuses and you're missing 98% chances to hit, which does not feel great. And I think that's where you get a lot of complaints about the system from this game anyway. But it is nonetheless an extremely fun time if you're into that sort of thing, which is obviously why it did so well and went on to inspire so many other games. That does bring us to the Steam Deck portion though, before we start wrapping this thing up. A couple things I wanted to mention in relation to the Steam Deck. For starters, Enemy Unknown and Enemy Within seem to play a bit differently here. So Enemy Unknown plays pretty well, and I was having trouble getting Enemy Within to run on the Steam Deck, and I looked it up, and apparently this is a common enough problem. Enemy Within likes to crash on the Steam Deck. I don't know what that's about specifically, which is a little bit annoying, but something to be aware of if this is something you're trying to play there. The other probably more important thing though is the controller setup. So XCOM Enemy Unknown does have controller support. It's just not turned on by default with the Steam Deck. So you're going to have to go into the game and like manually switch on the controller support so the keys switch over and stuff. And even then, you're probably going to have to like reconfigure those controls to be something you want to use. And I would imagine both of those cases, more than likely, is why the game, officially speaking, has a playable rating. So can you play it on the Steam Deck? Yes, and TRPGs typically do pretty well on that platform, but expect a little bit of work probably on your end to make it a good experience. Which brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, one thing I really enjoy about XCOM series as a whole is how well it blends both the strategy and tactical layer. A lot of TRPGs lead into the tactical side of things, and XCOM, I think, has really led the way in making each strategy and tactical layer interact in a way that feels really satisfying and impactful. You see a lot of other games in this genre not ever really quite hit that level. And because of it, XCOM really kind of feels like you have to interact with all of these systems in order to do really well. And that's just something that a lot of other games seem to struggle with comparatively. And if that's your thing, these games do that really, really well. It also set up that great foundation for tactical combat, so much that so many games have copied or borrowed from its homework since. This game has been used as inspiration for so many other games, it's actually kind of crazy. And so honestly, just going back and seeing the sort of core of it and where that all got started as a bit of historical frame of reference for these other video games is something that I at least think is really, really cool. Now, on the negative side, lack of mission variety, man. So many of the missions are essentially either move to the other side of the map or kill everything. There's one or two others that'll throw a curveball at you, like some of the actual curated missions are a little more interesting than that, but I think the mission variety in particular is where this game falls a little bit short, because even with Enemy Within, there's just not a lot there. And it's, probably lucky then that the game itself is not terribly long in a single playthrough. Like sub 20 hours is not unheard of in any way. And another negative for this game that might sound a little weird is that it keeps trying to update this game's release over on Steam over the years with just like various problems. They've updated the EULA, which had a bunch of like data collection stuff that was not warranted. They tried to put in the launcher a couple years ago and that was a mess. And I just kind of wanted to call that out here in the negatives. The amount of times they've tried to sneak stuff into this game and wound up causing problems with it is a little bit strange and something to be wary of, I feel. But mostly, I would just say that XCOM Enemy Unknown and Enemy Within are like a great foundation, but they really could have stood to expand that foundation a little more, which is something they did go on to do with things like XCOM 2, of course, but you can kind of just feel that in this game. And if you enjoy that slightly tighter experience, then you'll probably enjoy this, of course, but it certainly feels a little more constrained than you might expect. Which brings me to my conclusion. So XCOM Enemy Unknown, the base game is still selling for like $30 US, and then the version that comes with all the DLC is like $50 US, but you would be insane to pay that given that this game is on sale all the time. In fact, I picked up both XCOM 1 and 2 and all of their DLC, I think it was for like $6 years ago. So on one hand, yes, it's a fantastic foundational TRPG that people should absolutely check out, but it's also from 2012 and you can find it for very cheap, and I would recommend you do so just on sheer principle. And luckily, because it is ultimately available for so cheap relatively often, I would recommend it if you like the genre, even if you don't wind up liking this game, just because I think it gives you such a good idea of why all the TRPGs and everything kind of followed suit with this game and tried to refine its formula in various ways to mixed success. Let's be honest. So whether you wind up loving it and just want to play as much of it as possible, or you simply want to play a very significant game within its genre, I think XCOM Enemy Unknown likely has you covered either way. Now, on my end, I will eventually get around to the second game, but it's going to be some time, as this already took an extremely long time. Mostly due to scheduling more than anything else, but I imagine something will happen in that effect with the second game as well, and 2 has a lot more going on anyway, so we'll see how it pans out, but eventually I will get around to it. And in the meantime, that has been my review for XCOM Enemy Unknown. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.